Hello, welcome to LPAC Shorts. My name is Bruce Director. I'm joined once again by Brian Lance, a longtime economics researcher and longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche. If you've been following our series of shorts here, we've been going through various aspects of the situation with the world and US economy in order to better understand what some of the fundamental issues are in trying to come up with a solution to get America back into a manufacturing superpower again. Excuse me. Instead of both the ridiculous Green New Deal and deconstruction policies of the Biden-Obama administration, Jimmy Carter redux, whatever you want to call it. And sort of stupidity on the side of the Republicans who don't really understand what the alternative is. They're sort of trapped in this von Hayek free trade policy. But there's a real solution to this. It was outlined by Lyndon LaRouche, who made advances in scientific discoveries around the science of physical economy, which were applied at least to some degree or another by the United States throughout its history, known as the American system of political economy. And one of the things that's been exposed by the pandemic, a problem with the whole idea of globalism, was exposed by the pandemic, but was there all along. It's just a crisis sometimes brings out things that people were not willing to pay attention to. And that is the question of the globalist supply chains, which have been sort of created basically to serve the financial system. These supply chains were created in order to facilitate the generation of financial instruments and the flows of financial instruments and so on and so forth, and not really from the standpoint of what is physically required to make an efficient economy, not only within the United States, but also worldwide. So Brian is here to explain some of this to us. And why don't you first, Brian, start out by maybe just giving people a sense of how this sort of shift in what we used to consider to be a supply chain, or even tell us what is a supply chain and how it got sort of financialized and so forth, which got us into this mess.
All right, well, that's covering a lot. Let's see if we can boil it down. Well, the first term most people are aware of is outsourcing, and that's a key concept to have in mind. Another concept is just in time and lean manufacturing. These are all other terms related, very closely related to this issue of supply chains. And it's the chasing of the almighty buck, only it was deliberate. It was a deliberate takedown of the US manufacturing, agro-industrial economy. I mean, a simple example, most people aren't aware, is trucking. Trucking right now, I mean, this was deregulated, trucking and rail. We're deregulated under Jimmy Carter. You mentioned Jimmy Carter.
Right.
So the deregulation.
He was the original free trader, right?
That's right. That's right. Milton Friedman and Jimmy Carter. Yeah. Today, 10% of the trucks of major carriers are not on the road because they can't find drivers. Because the deregulation of trucking made it hell for truck drivers. Moving in and out of ports, you're paid by the job, and the ports are congested, which means you sit there and you don't make a dime. Long haul trucking, a similar hell. And so who wants to be a truck driver? And this is repeated again and again and again.
So the people who actually do the physical transportation of goods, which is essential to the supply chain of a physical economy, are not making anything. But somebody made money off this shift, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Precision, you have in the rail industry, you have precision scheduled railroading. Well, the big rail companies, there's 5 or 6 of them, they've carved up the country. They have record profits that helps Berkshire Hathaway and so on and so forth. But and that goes to the higher level, as you know, the financial oligarchy, Wall Street, the City of London. From the board of directors of corporations, they've dictated this. They've dictated the idea of cutting costs. Just in time, for example, is that you deliver the goods, you deliver the labor to the production process at the very last moment. You reduce inventories, or overhead. Supposedly you cut costs. And of course, we saw what happened when the whole supply chain, the whole global supply chain, like a set of dominoes, came down. What happens when everybody's doing everything just in time and something goes wrong somewhere up and down that chain? So that's a case, an example in point.
Right. So there was a deliberate policy. I remember back in the Carter administration, there was a Council on Foreign Relations report called Controlled Disintegration, which our good friend of Paul Volcker implemented.
The 1980s project. Yeah.
Right. And then introduced 21% interest rates, which may be coming back with the Biden inflation. In order
we'll see what comes out of the meeting in Wyoming.
Yeah, right. Up. In order to collapse the physical economy, but so it was a deliberate policy of deindustrializing the United States, cutting back on the costs of labor, productive powers of labor, squeezing the labor force, but at the same time creating new financial instruments, which then could provide profits for these new financial structures.
I think a point to make there is you're leaving out the value of the workforce, of labor power, which is the
right.
real source of wealth, as you know. You're reducing the workforce to just so many clogs. They're not even clogs anymore. They're digital entries. They're the basis for algorithms and so on and so forth. And everything is done from the standpoint of maximizing a predatory financialization process and the destruction of the actual physical process of production.
So in the original, in the first phase of this, in the 1970s and early 1980s, this was done internally in the United States, although some of this was going on internationally. But then with the advent later of the GATT and the free trade and the NAFTA, and then the World Trade Organization and so forth, and the globalization and the outsourcing to China, this sort of just-in-time looting of our supply chains or restructuring of the supply chain process was globalized, right? I remember back in the 90s, there was this ridiculous thing where the Chinese were importing goods on ships coming into the port of Long Beach, and we were exporting trash back to China so that they could recycle it.
Right, now we're exporting back empty containers.
Right.
The whole containers are coming in, and the whole supply chain is jammed up from the ports to the railroads to the freight yards, for delivery. But then when they're freed up, they're turned around and sent right back to China on ships.
They don't even want our trash anymore.
No, they don't. Officially, they don't. They don't accept our trash anymore.
So what?
I think
go ahead.
Most people don't think about. This is outside of manufacturing and machine tools and all that. Nursing, take the medical area, medical care. From the insurance companies and the HMOs. Again, from Wall Street. Hedge funds, BlackRock, equity funds, sitting on the board of directors of these hospital chains. They dictated, we're going to use more data. We're going to cut corners. Remember that term, cut corners?
Yeah, right.
And so even before COVID came along, doctors, the number of hospital beds, the number of nurses per, 1,000 patients, just as an example, was going down, 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 down. And now, of course, hospitals are operating with 20 or 30% fewer nurses than they require, because again, we've turned the job into a hell, a living hell.
Right. That's a good example. Okay, so we could probably speak for a long time about all the problems, and I think that, you know, one of the
it's not a laughing matter, but yes, we could go on and on. Yes.
Well, but you know, Leibniz says this is the best of all possible worlds. So one of the benefits of the pandemic is it finally exposed the rot of this kind of globalist system. So the real question is, well, how should you think about organizing supply chains and so forth? I mean, from the standpoint of physically doing it, setting aside the second question, which we may not have time to get into in today's discussion, but of how you would actually go about implementing it in terms of untangling these financial structures which have been built up. I mean, a lot of times what happens is you destroy a system, you then create a financial structure that profits off the destroyed system, and then you say we can't rebuild the destroyed system and change it because it'll bring down the financial structure which you created to profit off the destroyed system. And you hear this argument all the time. Well, we can't reshore. We can't bring things back on. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tubes. We heard this about deregulation of electricity out in California, right? So that's the excuse, right? And obviously we can create whatever financial structures we want, but let's start with what is it we want? What kind of reorganization of the supply chains and the physical economy?
Yeah, well, I think
Americans really be fighting for,
right? A major quote unquote savings from outsourcing and just in time and so on is we said, well, we don't need infrastructure anymore because we're outsourcing it all. It's going to be produced over there, so we don't need an electricity grid. We don't need rail. We don't need whatever. Well, that's where you start now to rebuild an actual productive U.S. economy, and to take advantage of what should be a skilled workforce that can contribute intellectually, culturally to that process, that productive process. Not just a suggestion box, but it's a broader process that's involved there. So infrastructure, large-scale infrastructure, as we mentioned last week, 200 gigawatts is a minimum requirement to say triple manufacturing in the U.S. A portion of that could come from reshoring, that is bringing back companies back into the U.S. And you can do that through tariffs, you can do that through tax abatements, penalties on the other hand, and so on and so forth. But most of it is going to be rebuilding new productive supply chains in the United States, and large-scale infrastructure, whether it's railroads, energy, waterworks. These kinds of large-scale infrastructure projects allow us to build up a workforce again, a young, new workforce, and simultaneously give our entrepreneurs, give companies, you know, a window, a 20-year window, 10, 20, maybe even longer window, because these projects are going to take our long-term projects. So they can invest, they know they're going to have a demand, there's going to be a demand for their product, not just in time, but there's going to be a demand 5, 10, 20 years down the road. So they'll make those commitments of not just money, that's the least of it, but resources, manpower, intellectual effort, engineering, and all the other qualities.
So once again, you've given us a very optimistic view of how to look at this thing instead of this sort of desperation, steady state or declining state system.
And we should look at Trump's project for vaccines, Warp Speed, Operation Warp Speed.
Right.
It shows us what we can do. When there's the leadership, we can mobilize the capabilities. If we say, as Trump basically did, to hell with the money, we got to get this done. The money isn't the way you calculate this thing. You calculate it in terms of productivity, increases in productivity, and results.
And we could do that with other areas. For example, we've all talked about the bottlenecks in pharmaceuticals and the fact that the U.S. is dependent on India, China, and other countries for the inputs, the precursors for necessary pharmaceuticals.
Every area. Yeah.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with having these countries produce these things, but we shouldn't be completely dependent on it, and we should have our own industrial capacity. I know that Just this month, they're shutting down one of the last manufacturing plants in West Virginia, which manufactures precursors for some very prevalent drugs, even like Tylenol and stuff like that. But again, you've given us a future orientation towards this thing. Think about 20, 30 years that you're building supply chains, not for just in time to get product out the door so that you can sell it in time for the next quarterly report.
And that changes what you require out of education. All of these things work through the whole society. What do we want? What do we value?
Changes everything in terms of the time frame. Well, why don't we leave it there for today, and we'll come next time with some more material on the question of how we rebuild the U.S. economy, so that you're not sort of ping-ponging back and forth. Our listeners are not ping-ponging back and forth between shaking your head at the stupidity of AOC and Joe Biden and the internet. Yeah, the rhinos. And then on the other hand, a bunch of rhinos who say, well, if you just get the government out of it and let free trade take its course, everything will work out.
The idea of free trade, right? That was the key. Oh, just leave it to the free market. Oh yeah, we saw what that created.
The argument was that all the jobs that you'll lose in the old industries, you'll regain in the new one. So what did we gain? We got rid of high paying, high skilled manufacturing jobs with benefits to warehouse workers peeing in bottles because they don't get bathroom breaks. But that's not really the debate. The debate is, what do you want 20 years from now? What kind of supply chain is going to organize your economy so that you can actually be in a different position 20 years from now?
Yeah, and it's ourselves as citizens that have got to organize this, demand this. We've got to make this the policy of the United States.
Absolutely.
The American system.
Absolutely, the American system with American characteristics. So why don't we leave it there, and we'll come back to you soon with an update with some further material on exactly how the U.S. economy can get back to the American system with American characteristics.
Good, Bruce.